please, friends, welcome our guests and prepare to learn about demystifying renewables in New York State.
All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for that beautiful introduction, Amir. Such a pleasure to be here. I'm Jacob Simon. So great to be here with you all. We're talking about the clean path to renewables in New York, community engagement in the clean energy transition. Kind of a mouthful, but I'm so glad to be here. I'm an environmental content creator. I basically walk around New York City and talk about good news and progress and positivity in the environmental space. Like Amir said, I've been coming to this event for a few years now. It's always such a great one with really great people, and we're having a fantastic conversation today. I'm gonna learn a lot. I'm really excited. We'll keep it casual. Like you said, we'll do around 30 minutes of talking, and then we'll leave it open to Q&A. So if you have burning questions, be prepared to ask them. And alongside me on this very, very comfortable couch is Amy Varghese, the Vice President of External Affairs at Clean Path New York and Energy Re. And you could do a lot better job of explaining yourself than I can, so please do.
Thanks, Jacob. I'm so happy to be here with you all at the end of what has obviously been a very busy Climate Week for, I'm sure, this whole room. My name is Amy Varghese. As Jacob said, I'm the VP of External Affairs for Clean Path New York. We'll get into what Clean Path is, I'm sure, over the course of our conversation, but where I sit in this big project is making sure that our communities and our public and our neighborhoods and all of our stakeholders have a voice in this project and that they're involved in how this project develops from start to finish. Renewable energy development in New York State is a really, really complex process. It involves lots of permitting and regulations and meetings and open hearings and what have you, and all of those things are meaningless unless people like you are in the room participating. So it's my job to make sure that we're doing a good job of getting everyone here in the room engaged. So yeah, we're talking today about strategies to do that well, what works, what doesn't, what we can do better, and hopefully find a new project and cause for you to support at the end of the day.
Yeah, so let's get right to it. So as you mentioned, there's so many things that go into renewable energy projects. For myself and probably a lot of people here, we don't know what that is. You know, I mean, in my head, it's like you have the idea of a renewable energy project, you get funding, you buy the land, you make it happen, maybe get some permits. But I'm sure it's a lot more than that, or it's a lot more nuanced. So without taking, the whole panel just to talk about this, can you give us a high level of what actually goes into making a renewable energy project come to the real world?
Yeah, it's a good place to start because it actually depends on where you are in the country. We happen to be here in New York State for Climate Week NYC, so I'll bring it home for us because we're all here and living and working and raising families here. So I think it's important for us to know how this process is unfolding where we live and work. So in New York State, we passed a law called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, known as the CLCPA in 2019. And this law is one of the boldest climate laws that's been passed in the world. And there are lots of different components to it, but the big one, the one that my team is focused on, is 100% clean electricity by 2040, which is a very important goal for reasons that we'll get into. But we realized that that goal was actually impossible to meet because New York State's electric grid isn't set up to actually meet that goal. We have an electric grid that was mostly built in the 70s and 80s. It's very, very old. It's very, very congested, and it actually can't deliver any kind of energy, let alone clean energy, efficiently. We have a grid in upstate New York that's 90% clean, fossil fuel free, and we have a grid in New York City where we all currently are, which is 90% fossil fueled. And we can't actually get the energy from upstate where it's clean to downstate where it's dirty because the grid is just that congested and old and fragmented. So we realized that in order to be able to meet this goal of 100% clean power by 2040, we actually have to build the infrastructure in the grid that can actually deliver that power where it needs to go. And it's especially essential here in New York City because we are ground zero for climate change. So many of our communities, especially lower income communities of color in the Bronx and Queens, are living in the shadow of fossil fuel plants that have been there for decades, and they're paying the consequences in terms of poor air quality, disproportionately bad health outcomes, asthma. And so when we talk about a clean climate future for New York, we have to start thinking about who are the communities that have been on the front lines of that conversation for a long time and making sure they're prioritized in that energy delivery. So that's how CleanPath came to pass. It was a project that was designed to be a link between the renewable resources that we know that we have upstate to the need that we have downstate and making that connection. One more thing before I give it back to you. So that link that I'm talking about is called transmission. It's going to be 175 miles of underground grid infrastructure that will connect those wind and solar resources I talked about to downstate. And that is where the permitting and the hearings and the community engagement comes in. Because to build something that big in New York City, you have to ask a lot of people for feedback along the way. So that's where I sit, making sure that feedback is built into the process.
Great, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously New York City is the biggest in the US. It kind of feels like the center of the world a lot of the time. We use a lot of energy. So I'm sure, you explained why you're doing it in New York based on the legislation and based on the fact that we have clean energy upstate already, so it's a no-brainer to connect this. Is there any other reason why New York City in particular is a good place for this to happen?
Well, I'm a New Yorker, so I'm biased, but we are really the epicenter of the state's economy. So much of our state's business, culture, arts are all focused right here in New York City. So when we talk about an energy transition for New York State, we have to make sure that New York City is a part of that conversation. And as I mentioned before, so many of the communities that are on the front lines of climate change, lower income communities of color, especially in the Bronx and Queens and Upper Manhattan, the fossil fuel plants that are powering the entire New York City economy are located in those communities. So again, when we talk about reducing emissions in New York, reducing bad air quality in New York, it has to start here because the problem is here.
And by connecting the clean energy upstate to New York City via this transmission line, is the idea that it turns off these polluting power plants and that's what helps these communities that have been burdened the most by dirty energy, or are there other ways that you're helping with that environmental justice as well?
It'll help turn them off. The goal is to get these fossil plants out of our electric grid as soon as possible. That won't be accomplished by one project. So we have a lot of other ones in the renewable energy development pipeline, not just developed by my team, but by many other public-private partners across the state. But this project in particular, if it comes online on time, will supply 15% of New York City's energy with clean electricity. So that's a big chunk of the problem right now. But it's not the only piece of the solution. We also have to get these other projects built and permitted. We have to reduce the emissions that are coming out of our buildings, making them more energy efficient. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to this problem. There's no silver bullet, but we are proud to be one big piece of how we get this done.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, fossil fuel pollution impacts all of us, not just these communities, but all of our communities. And I'm pretty sure fossil fuel pollution accounts for 1 in 5 deaths worldwide. So we definitely need to do this as fast as possible. Just to scratch my own curiosity itch, what is the transmission line? Like, is it these utility towers that we see that I associate with electricity or phone lines? Is it underground? Like, what does it actually look like?
So historically, transmission looks exactly like what you described. If you see those overhead lines when you are driving around, especially if you go to upstate New York, you can see kind of, if you're in the Catskills or whatever, you can see like the cuts through the mountains where the transmission lines are routed. So our line is actually all underground and all underwater. So you'll never see it. And it's designed that way to be as minimally community impactful as possible. We didn't want to disrupt any more land than necessary to get this project built. So actually what this project does, it routes underneath where those overhead transmission lines already are, so we don't have to take up more space than that is already being taken up by these lines that already exist. And by doing that, we're working with communities that have experience hosting energy infrastructure, so they sort of know how to work with the utilities and the developers that are doing this work. So we have pre-existing relationships there that we can lean on. But that being said, even though we are going underground and underwater and you won't see it, there's still a lot of environmental and ecological and permitting work that's done to make sure that we're doing this in the safest way. The technology that we're using is called HVDC technology. And it's really the most efficient way to deliver energy over long distances you lose less energy along the way. Usually when you deliver energy on those overhead lines, you lose power along the way because it's just not, it's a very outdated way of delivering energy. HVDC is very, very efficient, but it's also very, very powerful, so you have to make sure that you're building it very, very safely. And again, by putting it in these areas that are already used for transmission, you're making sure that you're not taking up more space than necessary.
That makes a lot of sense. And the efficiency is obviously fantastic. The fact that we're connecting to clean energy upstate, the fact that we're able to turn off polluting power plants in New York. As someone who lives in New York City, in Brooklyn, which has my heart, how else will this affect me? I think there's a lot of talk around utility prices this summer, and obviously they fluctuate a lot, but a lot of New Yorkers are disgruntled with energy prices. Will this impact prices in the short term, in the long term? Are there other ways that this will directly or indirectly affect me?
Yeah, I'll start with the last part of your question first about ratepayer impact. So that's such an important question, and it's rightfully the first question that people ask when they talk about the energy transition. Is it going to be expensive? And I always want to point out, first and foremost, that we are already paying the price for not having a clean energy economy and a clean energy grid. We all lived through this summer extreme heat waves, a very unreliable electric grid. I think huge parts of Queens had their grid shut off on one of the hottest days of the year because it couldn't handle the capacity of ACs that everyone was plugging in, turning on that day. In upstate New York, we saw tornadoes and wildfires that are like $1 billion each when they're over to recover from. So all of us are already paying lots and lots and lots of money for the cost of inaction. So I want to start there. And then also, I'm sure we saw a couple years ago when Russia and Ukraine were at the height of their turmoil, our electric bills went up because suddenly our energy prices were connected more than ever to a fossil fuel economy overseas that was totally in chaos. So our energy bills currently are tied to global weather forces, economic forces that are totally out of our control. And one of the good things about what this project is doing and what New York State is doing is we're trying to hook ourselves onto our own wind and solar power, so we're a little bit more energy dependent and not so at the mercy of these global economic forces that can make our bills swing wildly up and down depending on what's happening in the world that day. So making ourselves a little bit more independent, I think, helps insulate our energy bills in the long run in a big way. But to your point, it is going to cost money to build this kind of infrastructure. The same way it costs money to build schools, the same way it costs money to build hospitals, the same way it costs money to build roads. We invest in these things because we know that if we don't have schools, hospitals, and roads, we pay the consequences down the line. So there is a cost. I think for our project in particular, depending on where you are in the state, it's about $1 per month more that you'd have to pay. But that also fluctuates based on, again, as I mentioned before, what's happening in the world. But I think everyone I've spoken to, and I've done all of the community engagement we've done on this project, when we talk about, the fact that New York paid $10 billion or so in the past couple of years for energy-related disasters, it seems like a good thing to do to insulate ourselves from future disasters.
Yeah, not to mention, as we speak, hurricanes in Florida have 1 million people without power at all. So obviously exacerbated by fossil fuels and climate change in general. So
I'll say too, as I mentioned, overhead transmission is, as you can probably guess, very exposed when you have extreme weather. You hear about power lines going down, for example. We see that a lot in upstate New York especially, but we see it here in downstate New York too. Because this Clean Path line is all buried underground, it's much more resilient against extreme weather. You don't have to, it's not going to be impacted by high winds and high rain. It's safely insulated below ground, so your power will be more reliable in the face of those kinds of storms that we're talking about.
Yeah, I always wondered, because we have these electricity utility lines above ground and phone lines. I believe internet and cable lines are all underground. Is there a reason why historically the majority of utility lines are above ground? Like, is it cheaper and just easier to do that despite it being less resilient?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, as I mentioned, so much of our electric grid and those transmission lines that make up the grid were developed in the 70s and 80s, and that was the technology that we had then. And it's really, really complicated to build transmission anywhere, including New York State. So Our electric grid has been, I think, very slow to update itself with the latest and greatest technologies, but it is happening slowly. Our project is doing it. There's another project called Chippy, the Champlain Hudson Power Express, which is also underground. We're slowly trying to replace these overhead lines with these more resilient, higher tech HVDC lines, but it's a process. It's expensive. There's permitting, as I mentioned. It can take up to 10 years to get one of these things built, but it's worth it, as I mentioned, because once you're done and you have the thing built, it'll last for 50, 60, 70 years, and it'll be resilient, as I said, in the face of whatever our climate throws our way.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And obviously, the making it happen is one step. Another step is communicating it. And I think the majority of people here, we don't need to convince them that clean energy projects are good and we should have more of them. And 2/3 of Americans overall, support the acceleration of clean renewable energy sources. But communication is not always easy, and I know this quite well when it comes to climate topics. That's all I do. I walk around and I talk to the internet about different important, but not always very entertaining topics, especially when you are competing with every other topic in the world, and food videos and travel and whatever it is on social media that is competing for your time. So first of all, before we talk about how you're able to communicate it to the public, I'd like to talk about why it's important. I think a lot of the things I'm able to talk about, people don't know about. And education is a really important first step, because if you don't know, you can't make the right decision. You can't advocate for legislation or organizations that are doing the right thing. So educating people on the fact that there is a better way is a great first step. But why, when it comes to renewable energy activities specifically? Because in my head, I'm just a guy who walks around and reports good news. What impact can I have on a renewable energy project, which feels almost up on a pedestal? It feels like it's such a big undertaking. There's so many moving pieces. There's the legislation, the permitting, the actually building it. And I know nothing about any of that. I know that I want renewable energy to come to my community, but what impact can I have as a regular person in helping move that forward?
It's a great question. And something I always say is that New Yorkers, all of us, are very good at complaining about things that we don't like, and we're less good about saying yes to things that we do like. So I'm with you. I'm always trying to find ways to let communities know how they can engage in these processes. And there are formal ways and there are informal ways, and you can sort of see what makes the most sense for you based on where you are in life. But so this project has to go through what's called, this is very boring, it's called an Article 7 permit, and it essentially is basically a year-long series of hearings and open houses that we have to do, and we want to do, to make sure that communities along the transmission line route that I described know what's happening, they know what to expect when it comes to construction, they know what the timelines are, and basically so they feel like they're and so that they are informed and involved in the process every step of the way. So it's always very helpful for people to come when we have these open houses and hearings, because not only does it give us feedback about what we can do to design the construction and development of this process to be as minimally invasive as possible, but it also shows the regulators that we work with at the state level that people do want to see these things happen in their communities. Because politics is a real influence in our renewable energy development. If a legislature or an executive sees a big outcry against a project, then they're less likely to do more projects that are renewable. But if they see that people want these projects in their neighborhoods and that, or even if they're skeptical but are willing to have the conversation about it, that just encourages more political will and support for these projects to continue. So the first thing I think is always to come to these things, if you can. On our end, we try to have these meetings in these houses at varying times during the day. So in case you have a non-flexible work schedule or you have childcare needs you have to think about, we try to have things at different times so that no matter what your day looks like, there's an opportunity for you to participate. We also have all of our materials translated into English, Spanish, and Greek, because those are the three languages that are most spoken in the route that I described. We wanted to make sure that language wasn't a barrier for getting involved in this process. And And then I also want to shout out, because this is kind of a new thing in energy development, we're also very, very active on social media. My colleague Bianca is in the room. We knew from day one that we wanted to have a really vibrant, active social media presence. So we're on Twitter and Instagram. We have a website too. And even if you're liking or sharing or following any of that content, those platforms are also watched by the same politicians and regulators and executives I described. And if they see people getting excited about these things, that shows them that it's a politically smart thing for them to support it too. So those are 3 things that you can do to get involved. I would say also, like, even just coming to a room like this, it gives me feedback. I mean, we haven't done questions yet, but when we do, like, I can take what questions you have and incorporate that into our public engagement and our messaging, so that the next time I do another meeting, I have more things I know people want to hear about, and we've already anticipated and have come ready with that information.
Yeah, and as someone who posts on social media every day for the past 2 years, I'm glad you're on social media. I've witnessed firsthand the power that it can have, and also the difficulties, and I'd love to talk about these for a minute. Maybe I can talk about some things that work well and not so well for me, and then we can compare it to clean energy projects. So I walk around and talk about good news and positivity, and it's all related to the environment. And I think that there are algorithmic problems, there are political problems, and there's also just a societal perception when it comes to certain climate topics that we are breaking through on, but are difficult to communicate on social media. And as an independent creator, I think I have more trust a lot of the time than an organization or a business, because I'm not selling anything. I don't have a higher agenda. I might be selling ideas or information, but someone seeing me just casually talking on my phone and being like, I'm a regular guy, you know, this is something I found and I believe in, and I want to communicate it in the best way that I can. That's something that resonates with people. That being said, I am, at the mercy of the algorithms, and I need to make videos that fulfill the things that work well on different social media platforms, for better or worse in terms of the communication. And that's just, what I signed up for, what all of us sign up for when we post on social media. But I think there are certain tactics that can help you break through. And the number one most important thing is community building. And you're doing this by engaging the public already. But when people are asking questions in the comments, replying to them, asking what they want to hear about, making videos on those topics, making them feel involved is something that's super powerful and keeps them coming back. I think a lot of the time, what I do when I'm creating a video is, first of all, when I'm researching and scripting it up, I ask if my mom will be able to understand what I'm talking about. And she is truly my biggest fan, and I know she'll be watching my video. So if in my head she can't understand a certain acronym or a certain word, I might say it depending on, if it's important to actually include it in the video, but then I will explain what it is after that. And, there's no point in gatekeeping this kind of information. Even if somebody does know what certain acronyms are, we might as well explain it to them at the same time, because it's just beneficial to all of us, and it makes it more shareable. And that's also like a second thing you want to think about when you're making this content. It's, you want to make something that people will share in a group chat or reshare to their Instagram story. And that's how you're able to reach new people. And the way that social media algorithms have gone, a lot of the time your followers don't see your content. It is strangers. So if you're making something that is easily shareable and easily understandable, and of course entertaining or informative, then you have a good chance of people sharing it. There are certain topics that are more controversial than others, particularly on social media, and as anyone, any type of creator or organization that talks about the environment, there will certainly be backlash, and there will certainly be trolling. And I think there's an important differentiation between those two, where if there's misinformation and people honestly don't understand what you're talking about and may reply, I don't necessarily agree with this, like I'm not sure why you included this in your story, that opens a conversation that you can have back and forth, and you can learn and grow together. If there's disinformation, which is deliberately, misleading or lying or trolling, or having a hate comment or something like that, is probably not beneficial to interact with those types of people. But overall, an engagement's an engagement. It helps boost your video, and it helps get your message across when that opens up an opportunity for you to have a conversation back and forth. I guess a few other things that I try and think about when I'm creating content are to try and tone down climate-specific languaging sometimes, depending on the video, to appeal to more people. When I first started making videos, I would intro the videos by saying, here's all the good climate news that I found from today. And then I changed it to just saying, here's the good news from today. And if you go on and listen to the videos, you'll know it's all climate and environmentally related. That's no secret. But there's just certain walls that come up with people when they associate specific climate language, climate change or legislation, things that have become politicized for who knows what reason, but that's the world we live in. And I guess that's a high-level kind of scope of what I see when I'm creating content. I'm curious if you see similarities, if you see differences, if there's certain things that you've learned don't work very well when you're communicating these environmental energy projects, and things that do work, don't and do, and then kind of give us a little insight into your world.
Yeah. So one thing that my colleagues and I talk about a lot, especially here in New York, is that climate change looks different depending on where you live and what your economic status is, and lots of other factors. So speaking broadly about climate change isn't always the most personal connection that one can make to a project. So, for example, in upstate New York, climate change looks like shorter growing seasons or other agricultural impacts. It looks like flooding in Westchester County. In downstate New York, it looks like really poor air quality. So instead of making people guess what we mean by climate change, we try to be really specific about what we're talking about. So when we talk about climate change as it relates to New York City, we're always very sure to talk about air quality and how this project and others will make it easier to breathe and reduce the asthma rates that we're seeing here. When we talk about climate change in Westchester, we talk about the fact that this community has seen huge amounts of flooding, and that by reducing emissions, we can help maybe alleviate some of those impacts. When we talk about climate change in upstate New York, we talk about the fact that your growing season used to be this many months, and now it's 2 months shorter. We should bring it back because that's not good for your bottom line. So we always try to translate these things into what makes sense to who we're talking to. Because climate change it's not a dirty word, but it isn't always the clearest word, and so we try to make sure that we're just being really clear about what we're talking about. And actually, what you just said about not using acronyms and sort of demystifying this stuff, it's a good reminder for me too, because even though I'm not a developer or an engineer, I'm still in it every single day, and it's important for me to be reminded to, I talked about Article 7 5 minutes ago, as if that's something that people in this room know or care about. But it's always important for me to remember to not use jargon. Even if I don't think I'm being jargony, it's really, really important to make sure that our content is as accessible to as many people as possible, and that we're not using any barriers to getting people interested or engaged. So, and again, these rooms are really important reminders of that. And I think also, I'll say this too, there are a lot of different opinions across the 175 miles of transmission that I'm talking about climate change and about, whether or not it's real or whether or not we should be doing anything about it. I know where I stand on it, but it honestly doesn't always matter what I think. I'm here to make sure that the communities I'm talking to feel connected to what's going to be built in their neighborhood. So one thing I think about a lot is not approaching people with skepticism or not belittling people for having different opinions than me. It's my job to just make sure that what I'm doing and what this project is doing is making sense to that person. And even if they don't believe in climate change or they don't believe that it's the existential issue facing our generation, they might believe that they need a stronger electric grid, and they might believe that they want their energy bills to be stabilized, and they might believe that they want their growing seasons to be back to normal. And if we can agree on those things, then then that's enough.
Yeah, it's meeting people where they are. It's talking in their language that they understand, not literal language, but what they know and are interested in. And I think that's a really important tactic when creating social media content as well. It's connecting what you're doing to something that people are already interested in. And climate touches everything. So if people are interested in sports, they're interested in food, they're interested in travel, whatever it is, climate is there. And you can hook them in with that other topic and explain the relation to climate. And I think the absolute master at this is a scientist, Dr. Katherine Hayhoe, who has a book called Saving Us, who really inspired my environmental communication. And she does talks around the world, at least around the country, and she goes to areas where climate change is not understood that well or talked about, and she'll do, an entire hour-long conversation completely about climate change, but without saying climate change. People that may not understand what climate change is, but they understand what drought and crop failure is, and that's very real to them, and it's affecting, the lives of these farmers in rural areas, and it's putting yourself in the shoes of the person that's listening to you and communicating it.
Humility.
Exactly.
Humility is a word that I try to keep in myself when I'm doing these meetings. It's not about me.
Right.
I'm not the one who has to host this thing in my backyard. It's making sure that whatever it is that gets this person up in the morning is what this project is trying to solve.
Totally. It's super important. Hard to remember sometimes when you're the one in the weeds making the decisions, but yeah, it's a very good reminder. I would like to, we got one or two more questions, then we'll open it up to Q&A. Can you connect the dots for me a little bit between when you're communicating about your project, why it's important, how it's beneficial, and then getting a regular person to take the next step into taking an action, into getting involved, giving you a comment. This is something that I struggle with, so excited to learn from you. Because people that really resonate with what I'm saying, it's still hard to get them off of social media. The platforms don't like it. They want people to stay, so they don't make linking things out easy. And I'm curious if you've noticed certain things that work well into actually getting someone to take the next step.
Yeah, we talked a lot about social media, and it is such an important place to build community and share information. But I think it's also important to remember that not everybody is on social media, and there are lots of generations and communities that don't consider that the primary place to get their news. So we have to make sure that we're putting information in other news outlets and other platforms as well, right? When we were up in Sullivan County in upstate New York a little while ago, and I asked somebody, where they get their news from, and they mentioned this local tiny community newspaper that has like a classified section. They're like, I check it every single day to see what's going on. And it's not a newspaper that would have been on my radar as one that we should be putting information in, but now I know, and now we put information there, and I make sure to put like an update on CleanPath every single quarter so that, that person and people in that same community are getting information about this project where they get their news. I'm less interested in making people come to where we are and more interested in going to where, where these networks currently already exist. So, yeah, again, I don't want to minimize social media at all. It's so important. I think everyone in this room probably is an active social media participant, but there are a lot of people that don't consider it their primary source, or it's one of many. So it's just being really open-minded about where you are publicizing your information. And to your point, if social media it makes it difficult to link out, for example, putting a link in a local bulletin. I know that you can't click it, but you'd be surprised. People type this stuff into the URLs and they hit go, and then they end up where they're supposed to go. So there are lots of different places you can get people, engaged and connected, and it's our job as developers to try and find them all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to just leave things off with your biggest takeaways on how your learnings and how they can apply to future renewable energy projects. And in conjunction with that, what do you imagine the future to be like? The future of New York City, maybe a more solar punk reality where we have more clean energy around us and just a better quality of life. To you, when you close your eyes and think about the future of New York, of the world, what does that look like, and how can we continue to get there?
Oh my gosh, such a great and big question, and what a great way to end Climate Week too.
I can go first if you need to think for a second.
I'm just thinking so many of my friends, for example, who are having children now for the first time, they are leaving New York City because they are worried about raising children in a place that has some of like the worst air quality on the eastern seaboard. And I would like that not to be the case. I would like parents to feel like the air that they can raise their children in is safe and breathable, and that asthma isn't like a 100% guarantee if you live in a certain area of New York City. So that's like a big dream of mine, is this clean air. It just seems like such a basic thing to expect for yourself, but it isn't. It's not a guarantee right now. So there's that. And then learnings along the way. I mean, again, like I think humility is a big one. Like it can be really easy when you're developing like a big project like this that is good and that is going to solve big issues to be, frustrated if things are delayed or if people don't see it your way from the get-go. And something that I'm always learning is that I learn more from people that disagree with me than I do from people that agree with me. And so if I go to a community and everyone starts out the day hating the project and everything about it and is worried about construction and doesn't want to see it, and they leave having been convinced that there is a use for this and that even if it doesn't look perfect, we can make it perfect together. Like those are learnings. It's never one or the other. You can work your way through it.
Yeah, and I'm super hopeful because of projects like Clean Path New York that exist and are being implemented to provide cleaner air. Like it's not a far off dream of having clean air in New York City. We know what the solutions are. We just need to implement them, and they're being implemented. And everyone that descended at this event and in New York upon the week, I mean, we're here to work on solutions, and I think that's really hopeful to me. And obviously, I like telling these optimistic stories. And yeah, I can't wait for this to progress. And yeah, have a better New York City coming through.
I mean, from your lips to whatever deity follows ears. Like, yeah, me too.
Definitely. We could open it up to Q&A. If anyone has a question, I'm not sure if we're going to have a roaming mic or if I can. I think we will. Great. Yeah.
I'm coming.
Thank you.
Where
Go
to?
ahead. We got one right here.
Hello, Amy. Thank you so much for sharing so much knowledge. So my name is Joycelyn, and I've worked as a consultant in the EV space. So my experience with working with different clients, such as utilities, where I have worked on EV programs to help manage peak demand. So my question is, as there has been like a rise in use of electric vehicles, how does New York think of how to accommodate this rise in peak demand? Because I know we're all heading to 100% clean power by 2040, and we already know that the grid already has challenges with transitioning and meeting the existing demand with clean power, right? So then with the increase of EV use, there's gonna be an increase of demand of clean energy. So I'm just curious, like, how does the state think of this? Because this is gonna be an additional demand, and we have to think about that in the transition to clean power. Thank you.
Thanks, Jocelyn. You raised such a good point because the state is moving toward electrification. They're trying to move away from the actual burning of fossil fuels. Electrification is good, but it means that the grid is more strained than ever before because we're plugging more things into it than ever before. We're plugging in EVs. I have, for some reason, like 2 phones and a laptop I'm plugging in every single day. I'm sure all of us are using the grid more than we ever have before. And as I mentioned, the grid itself was never designed to keep up with this kind of demand. And so we're seeing more and more grid failures. We're seeing more and more congestion. And if we're going to transition to clean power, it can't just be through the development of new wind and solar and offshore wind. It needs to be also just as much with the modernization of our grid. So this project, the one that I'm working on, is one piece of that. There are so many others, but I talked a bit about permitting here. it's a blessing and a curse because getting these things built is very, very slow. It involves lots of different agencies, lots of different government bureaucracies at the federal, state, city, local level. And while that's good, we definitely want to make sure that all of our government partners are engaged every step of the way. I think anything we can do to increase coordination between those entities would help speed up the grid's modernization and help ease some of the grid failures and congestion that you're alluding to. But those things have to happen in parallel. We can electrify, we can make sure that people are incentivized to use EVs, but we also have to make sure that the grid is set up to be able to handle what you just described.
Yeah, got some more questions here. I see a hand up here.
Hi, my name is Taylor. I am also an energy infrastructure nerd. One question I have is really about like the need for clean path, right? So you talked a lot about our historical transmission lines. Many of them were built under an eminent domain. And what I'm curious about is like, as we know there's this need for grid modernization to get the right power to the right place, why are they not able to do it under eminent domain? And where does clean path come in and kind of having to push this forward?
So CleanPath doesn't have to use eminent domain, which we consider very fortunate because we are routing under existing transmission lines and rights of ways. And so we're able to build this large project without having to do extra greenfield development work, which is great. And actually the federal government is increasingly interested in incentivizing projects that co-locate in either existing rights of ways or, for example, in federal highways, all for the same reason, because as much as permitting, even if you're in a right of way, is complicated, it gets infinitely more complicated if you're greenfielding. So I think there's a lot of incentive and desire to be creative about what we're routing under and co-locating with, because that does save a lot of energy and time. I don't want to say that greenfielding should never be used, because we do have a big energy need here, but there's still so much potential that hasn't been tapped with existing right-of-ways, and I kind of want to see more of that explored and used up before we resort to having to do greenfielding to get this done.
Great. Anybody else? See a hand over here and over here. Go here first.
Hi, my name is Wasim. Thank you for the wonderful conversation, very enriching. Amy, my question is to you. It's really interesting to hear about how the community is very involved in the decision-making process. I come from a community-centered research and design research standpoint. So my question is around what are some of the sort of risks, drawbacks, or unintended consequences of a large project like this? And how do you go about solving some of those challenges? I'm sure the community has brought up some of these questions time and time again. So could you shed light on some of those POVs?
Yeah. And it's a great question, because something I think about a lot is not trying to make light of some of the construction impacts that projects like this have, because I don't want, I think communities rightfully can smell BS, and if you say that everything is going to be great and it's not, going to be a bother at all, then they know that you're lying, and then you're starting from, less than zero. So I try to be honest. So what this physically looks like is a 5-foot trench in the ground, and there's a transmission line built into it, and then it's covered up. And because we're in those rights of ways, it's not anywhere that you would necessarily be walking around in anyway, because these areas are sort of cordoned off for electrical infrastructure use already. But it is construction, and that is impactful, and there'll be trucks that are coming in and out while things are being built. Temporary, but we try to be honest about the fact that you might see some traffic in your neighborhood while this thing is built. The transmission line also routes underwater in the Hudson River. We purposely routed it to avoid some very ecologically sensitive areas in the river where we know that there are species that that are important to New York State that are, use those areas as breeding grounds, for example. So we route around those areas, but we still want to make sure that any submarine wildlife, for example, that's in the river isn't unduly impacted by construction. So we're making sure that we're timing that construction so that for example, fish have migrated away during the construction seasons. It's all about doing whatever studies and surveying work that you can do now, so that when you are in construction, you've done everything you can to make sure that your impacts are minimal. In New York City, if most of you live here, I'm sure you see your roads ripped up once in a while for Con Ed or whatever to do their road work. So building this will look pretty much exactly the same. There will be some very hideous orange red tape surrounding, a couple of streets for probably 2 weeks, and then the road is covered up and patched up and it's done. So it's not nothing. There are construction impacts that we have to think about as a community and that we have to think about as a developer to minimize, but all of them are temporary. And again, I think being honest about them at the front gets people, number one, like sort of their expectations are set as to what they can expect to see. And also they can tell us like, oh, there's a huge block party that happens at this time. Like, it'd be great if you weren't in construction then, and we can say, great, like, we'll make sure not to be there during that time. It's all about just making sure we can manage what the construction will look like so that, again, it's at least a little bit as a burden as it possibly can be.
Great. And then one last question over here.
Hello, my name is Emily. I work with New York City Public Schools in their Office of Sustainability, which has nothing to do with my question, but you sort of touched on this just now. I'm just wondering, I used to live upstate New York. I know there tends to be oftentimes a rhetoric of sort of anti-city in the sense that like it's perceived that the city gets a lot of attention, gets a lot of resources, and I can just imagine with a project like this where you're doing work upstate, which is sort of to benefit the city, that you run into some maybe public opposition from upstate communities. I'm just wondering if you see a lot of challenges from that. And sort of a side question to that is, do you have any sense of what we can envision for New York City's grid in terms of what sort of share can we ultimately get hyper-locally in terms of like solar panels, in terms of maybe offshore wind, versus how much will we need to sort of, import our renewable energy to the city from elsewhere?
I'm gonna take the first question first, and then I might ask you to repeat the second one because I think I cut out a little bit there. Yeah, there is some tension, I think, between upstate and downstate communities. And the tensions, by the way, exist on both sides. It's not just, upstate New York feeling a type of way about New York City. These communities look different. They have different priorities. Their economies are different. And so, there's, I think, a sense of, I think people want to feel like they're not being taken advantage of, and that people want to feel, and that what they're going through is fair. The fairness is is a big topic, I think, in this conversation. And I think the great thing about this particular project is the benefits that this project brings to the state, they're statewide. This project is going to reduce 22% of fossil fuel-fired electricity across New York City. So that means that the NOx, SOx, and PM 2.5, which are the major drivers of air quality issues, those are reduced across the state, not just in New York City. And then we also are going to reduce 49 million tons of CO2, which is the equivalent of taking 9 million cars off the road. And that benefit is also felt across New York State, not just in New York City. The project is going to create 8,000 jobs across New York State. And it's also going to, just because of the things that you have to buy and build along the way, catalyze about $4 billion in economic investment across the state. So the benefits of this project are statewide, even if most of the electricity itself is being injected into the downstate electric grid. Like, it's really incredible how greening up one portion of the grid can ripple across the entire state's economy and infrastructure and air quality. So that's one thing. But I'll say too, we understand that hosting energy infrastructure is often not the most fair process. Like some communities have had to host more infrastructure than others, and that's a tension that we have to deal with. For example, downstate New York has hosted all these fossil fuel plants for generations now, and we've talked about what that has resulted in terms of public health. Upstate New York has had to host a lot of transmission infrastructure that delivers energy down, and they've had to deal with the repercussions of that. So it's about finding ways that this project can sort of make the distribution of burden equitable, whether that's by, again, making sure the benefits are felt throughout, but also if there are investments that we can make along the way in terms of supporting local community organizations, for example. We try to do that too, so that, again, there's incentive for communities to raise their hands and say yes to these kinds of things. And I missed the last part of your question, I'm sorry.
It was so long, I'm sorry. No, I'm just wondering with that, for reaching our goal of 100% renewable by 2040, do you have any sense of like how much New York City could end up, what share we could end up getting from our renewable needs more hyper-locally, so like projects that are more, local solar, the offshore wind, I guess I could consider fairly local, versus sort of importing from other places. I don't know if you have any sense of that, but.
I don't know if I have the most technical answer to that question, but again, the CLCPA has established some very, very strict mandates for this stuff. And one of them is 100% emissions for electricity by 2040. And from what I understand, the bulk of that is supposed to come from offshore wind and solar generated right here in New York. I mean, some hydropower I think is coming from Canada, but for the most part, I think we're trying to go at it alone on this, which is a really bold prospect, right? Like getting ourselves unhooked off of foreign fossil fuels. But I think there's a long way to go to get enough energy into our grid to make that a reality. And as I mentioned, making sure we have enough transmission to deliver that energy. We have to make sure our buildings are set up to handle the kind of electrification that we're talking about too, because that's a big piece of the equation. We can electrify all we want if our buildings are, using systems that aren't compatible with what we're trying to push toward, then we have a delay in implementation. So that climate in New York is so fascinating because there's so many different pieces of it that all have to work in tandem to meet this goal that we've set up. And I think we might have to tweak some of the implementation along the way to make it a reality, but the processes are there. I think it's just getting the gears of government and private sector development coordinating to make it all work together.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amy. This was so great to chat with you. Everyone, there are many more panels going on throughout the day, so stay tuned. Check out Clean Path New York. I believe you have a public comment section on your website.
Yeah, I'll do a plug. We're at cleanpathny.com. There's a section on our website called Public Documents, and if you go there, you can see a bunch of fact pages, decks, PowerPoints, FAQs, all of that, but there's also a link to it's called a case matter, I guess where the public can go and comment to the state about what they want to see happen on this project, whether they support it or don't support it or have feedback along the way. I encourage you to check it out, and if you have good or bad or neutral things to say about it, I want to hear everything, so please check it out.
Great. And thank you all. If you need some good news and optimism, check out Jacob Simon Says, and we'll be around.
Thank you guys so much. If you wanted to provide any feedback from this panel, please scan the QR code. We would love to know how you guys are liking the event today, what you want to see more of. Please stick around. We're going to have Seth Godin and Amir speak in just about 5 minutes.